Jensen Sawyer had a deceased true love in his heart. In the 4th year of our marriage, he kept a girl who resembled his true love. And I was the last person in the world to know. That day, the girl and I wore identical red dresses. Jensen frowned at me. "Red doesn't suit you, go change." I didn't change my new dress. Instead, I chose to change the husband who didn't like me wearing red. When she realized we were wearing the same dress, the girl next to Jensen pouted unhappily. He leaned over and whispered something in her ear. The girl named Elena obediently turned and left. Then, Jensen walked through the room full of guests and came up to me. He looked at me, slightly frowning. "Red doesn't suit you, go change." As soon as he said this, everyone present fell silent. Suddenly, someone snickered, "How amusing, it's just a case of blind imitation with ludicrous effect." I looked up at the person who spoke. It was Jensen's cousin. She was also the best friend of his deceased true love. No one told me about it when we got engaged and married. That Jensen had a prematurely deceased true love in his heart. I only found out when I was pregnant with Jeremy and was about to give birth. In the 4th year of our marriage, he kept a girl who resembled his true love. And I was still the last person in the world to know. Seeing me sitting there without moving or speaking, Jensen's face darkened slightly, and his voice rose a bit. "Candy?" My gaze went past the people sitting in front of me, landing on Jensen's face. Maybe it was a couple's fun. He rarely wore a dark red tie. I looked at that dark red on his chest. Suddenly, everything around me fell silent. Before he could speak again in displeasure, I stood up, pushed the chair aside, and walked out. Jensen's face eased a little. "Change your clothes and come back quickly." I pressed my lips together and even gave him a slight smile. But I didn't say a word. I didn't go to the lounge to change my new dress. Nor did I return to the banquet hall. I just turned and walked to an empty side door. And left directly. It was drizzling outside. I didn't bother with an umbrella. And walked straight into the rain. When I returned to the Sawyer house, the servant happily told me, "Madam, the old Mrs. Sawyer brought the young master over, they are waiting for you." I was overjoyed, and immediately quickened my pace. In the 1st year of our marriage, I gave birth to Jeremy. But Jensen's mother, Mrs. Sawyer, said that my body was severely damaged during childbirth, and she feared I wouldn't have the energy to take care of the child. When Jeremy was a month old, she came and took him away herself. At that time, I was almost devastated. My body hadn't fully recovered. I could only cry and beg Jensen. But in the end, all I got was 1 day a week to see my son. I cherished it very much. But time flew by, and Jeremy grew up. But he became more and more distant from me. As I climbed the stairs, I heard the laughter filling the room. Jeremy was controlling a remote-controlled car, playing very skillfully. Mrs. Sawyer, the servants, and the nanny were all surrounding him, clapping and cheering. I couldn't help but walk over, my eyes fixed solely on that small figure. Jeremy glanced at me, then continued playing with the car. I patiently waited for him to finish playing, squatting down to try to hug him. But he directly turned and ran to Mrs. Sawyer. "Grandma, I've seen Mom, I want to go home, go home." He hugged Mrs. Sawyer's leg, snuggling affectionately in her arms. Mrs. Sawyer's face was full of smiles. She picked him up. "My little darling, let's go home now." My hands were still outstretched foolishly, but I was holding nothing but cold air. It wasn't until after Mrs. Sawyer took Jeremy away for a long time that I squatted on the ground and cried silently. It seemed nothing here, no one, made me want to stay anymore. It was very late. I went upstairs to pack a few things, all the documents and some personal items to take away. I didn't touch anything else. Ding! This novel reminds you to click the subscribe button in the bottom right corner to read the complete novel. Walking through the courtyard, I saw that patch of crabapple flowers in the misty rain. These flowers were the ones I personally planted the year I married Jensen Sawyer. I really liked them. But I only stayed for 2 minutes. I didn't look back again. Jensen was slightly tipsy. He glanced at his watch. Candy Ambler had been gone for almost an hour. It shouldn't have taken this long. He frowned, took out his phone, and sent a message to Candy. "Why aren't you here yet?" But there was no reply. Jensen's assistant came over instead. He bent down and whispered respectfully. "The driver said, Madam has already gone back." Jensen's expression darkened. This was the first time Candy had thrown a tantrum. But he always hated it when women acted this way. "Tell Elena to come over." The assistant's heart skipped a beat. But he still nodded. "Yes, I'll go right away." When Elena returned, she had changed her clothes. And her hair was down. She must have just cried. Her eyes were still red. There was a pure, fresh beauty about her. Jensen saw her like this and was visibly distracted. "Mr. Sawyer, did I do something wrong tonight?" Elena bit her lip, lifting her eyes to look at Jensen. She had 2 small moles at the corner of her left eye. They were more noticeable without makeup. And in this spot, she resembled Jensen's true love, Norma. Jensen cupped Elena's face. He lowered his head and kissed the small mole, murmuring softly in his drunken state, "Norma." When he learned that Candy hadn't returned to the marital home that night, it was already 3 days later. Jensen didn't care much. Although Candy was the youngest daughter of the Ambler family, she was different from the other Ambler daughters. She had gone missing as a child and reportedly suffered a lot. She still had old scars on her body. She was found by the Ambler family when she was already 20. She hadn't even attended college. Her personality had long been shaped, silent, timid, and weak. So, the Ambler family didn't like her. His mother, Mrs. Sawyer, didn't like her either. So when they got married, Mrs. Sawyer set a condition. There would be a wedding, but they wouldn't get a marriage certificate until Candy gave birth to a son. Later, Candy gave birth to Jeremy. But Mrs. Sawyer still didn't mention the marriage certificate. Candy was so timid that she never dared to bring it up. When he returned to the marital home, a week had passed since Candy left. It was already the end of April. When he got out of the car, he immediately saw the crabapple flowers that had started to wither. The servant saw his displeased face and quickly explained, "Madam always took care of them herself and didn't allow us to help." "She's not back yet?" Jensen walked forward slowly, his brows furrowed even more. The servant shook her head and whispered, "Madam hasn't come back." "What day is it today?" Jensen suddenly asked. "Saturday." "Did you pick up Jeremy?" Every Saturday was the day Candy and Jeremy met without fail. "Yes, he should be here soon." Jensen nodded, his expression returning to its usual calm. "Tell Candy that if she doesn't come back within an hour, I'll send Jeremy back to the old house." Jeremy sat on the living room carpet, unwrapping a new toy. A servant walked in and cautiously spoke. "Sir, I've called Madam." Jensen acknowledged with a hum, his gaze falling on Jeremy's small face. He looked very much like Candy, especially his eyes. Fan-shaped double eyelids, long and thick eyelashes. His complexion also took after Candy, very fair, a cute little guy. The servant, however, stood there without leaving. After a while, she added, "Madam said she's not coming back." Jensen suddenly looked up. The servant was so frightened that she fell silent. Even Jeremy seemed to sense something was wrong, putting down the toy in his hand. After a moment, Jensen suddenly let out a cold laugh. Then he stood up and called Jeremy, "Jeremy, Daddy will take you back." Jeremy stood up but asked, "Aren't we waiting for Mommy?" "No, we're not." Jensen bent down and picked him up. "Is Mommy not coming back?" Jeremy seemed a bit happy but also strangely not too happy. Jensen carried Jeremy out of the living room and down the steps. As they passed through the half-withered garden of crabapple flowers, Jensen finally spoke. "Yes, Mommy is being naughty, so she's not allowed to come home for now. This is her punishment. It seems that from the time I returned to the Ambler family, married Jensen, and gave birth to Jeremy, these few days have been the most relaxing and free period for me. No need to get up at 6:30 sharp. No need to cater to Jensen's preference for Western-style breakfast every day. No need to look forward to Saturdays every week, only to be disappointed and sleepless late at night. No need to think about when Jensen would come home tonight. Or if he would come back at all. I could sleep until 10 o'clock. Then get up leisurely and cook myself a very spicy beef noodle soup. I could also binge-watch dramas until 3 in the morning, crying through a whole pack of tissues. Even when Jeremy's kindergarten teacher called, asking me to participate in a parent-child activity. I was still a bit sad, but I calmly told the teacher. I have no relation with the Sawyer family anymore. Please do not contact me regarding Jeremy Sawyer in the future, thank you. After hanging up, I looked at the phone calls from the Sawyer family servant that came punctually every Saturday and frowned slightly. Tomorrow is Saturday again, and at 9 o'clock in the morning, I did not wait for the servant to call. Instead, I took the initiative to call. Madam? Sir, it's a call from Madam. The servant's voice sounded excited and joyful. Jensen felt a slight tremor in his heart, but his voice remained cold when he replied to the servant. Tell her Jeremy is not coming over today. The servant was stunned for a moment but still conveyed the message. After a moment, she came back again. Madam is asking if it's convenient for you to take the call. Jensen put down the newspaper in his hand, lowered his eyes, and slowly folded his shirt sleeves. Then he reached out. Give it to me. Taking the phone, he heard a faint breathing sound. That breathing was so distant, yet so close, like it was gently tickling his heart. He saw the large crabapple flowers outside the floor-to-ceiling window. Suddenly, he remembered the scene when she almost bumped into him while running towards him with flowers one day. That was after the wedding, one of the rare times she appeared lively. Jensen thought, since she was willing to lower her head, he would give her a way out. Candy, do you realize your mistake? The breathing on the other end seemed to pause for a moment, then her gentle voice sounded. Jensen, we didn't register our marriage 4 years ago. I know. He casually curled his lips. After all this fuss, she just wanted to register their marriage. In his view, it was a small matter, just a formality. So, if we separate now, there's no need for a complicated divorce process. The smile on Jensen's lips suddenly vanished. What did you say? His fingers clenched around the phone, each joint tightening abruptly. Don't have the servants call me every Saturday anymore, I won't be coming back. I've already spoken very clearly with Jeremy's teacher at the kindergarten. Candy, what do you mean by this? Jensen Sawyer, I won't ask for any of your assets, but the $8.88 million you gave me when we got married, along with all the gold jewelry, I won't return them to you. Consider it compensation for giving birth to Jeremy. Jensen had lived for nearly 30 years and had never been this angry. But the more furious he got, the calmer his voice became. Are you sure about this? I'm sure. Candy didn't hesitate at all. Jensen hung up the phone directly. The servant standing not far away didn't dare to make a sound. Just now, Mr. Sawyer had seemed to be smiling. They had all breathed a sigh of relief. After all, the atmosphere at home had been getting increasingly strange and oppressive these days. But now, after Jensen hung up the phone, his face was so cold it was frightening. Take the phone away. Jensen stood up and called the servant over. He took a couple of steps outside and saw that patch of crabapple flowers. He felt even more stifled. Turning around, he instructed the servant, clean up the master bedroom upstairs. Move Candy's things somewhere else, I don't want to see them. The servant was stunned for a moment but quickly nodded in agreement. Jensen strode outside. The phone vibrated, a call was coming in. He glanced at it, it was from Elena. But he had no interest in answering. A fake is just a fake. Elena couldn't compare to Norma. She couldn't even compare to Candy. That night, he really shouldn't have embarrassed Candy. She was angry and aggrieved, unwilling to come back. If she wanted to make a scene, let her. With her temperament, after being wronged and hitting a wall outside, she would naturally know to come home. But Candy seemed to have vanished. After that phone call, there was no more news. There was even a time when Jeremy wasn't feeling well. Mrs. Sawyer brought him over, hoping Candy could give him a massage. Jeremy had been weak since birth. Candy had self-taught many pediatric care techniques. But when the servant called, the phone was already disconnected. Mrs. Sawyer was furious. I've never seen such a heartless mother in my life. If she doesn't come back today, then she should never come back. Anyway, the Sawyer family is the same with or without her. Mrs. Sawyer left angrily with Jeremy. Jensen sat on the sofa, not speaking for a long time. Until dusk, when he instructed the driver to prepare the car. To the Ambler house. When the car arrived outside the Ambler house, the Ambler family was quite surprised. They respectfully invited him in. Seeing Jensen's displeased expression, Mr. and Mrs. Ambler exchanged a glance. Carefully, they asked, "Did Candy do something wrong again?" The couple wasn't very concerned about this daughter they had painstakingly found halfway through their lives. Especially since their grandson was almost 4 years old, and their daughter still hadn't gotten the marriage certificate. The Ambler couple felt stifled just thinking about it. Jensen paused with the teacup in his hand. "She hasn't been back these past few days?" The Ambler couple was even more surprised. "No." Jensen slowly put down the teacup. She hadn't returned to the Ambler house. In the capital, she had no other place to go. Where had Candy been these days? "Are you two having a fight?" Mrs. Ambler asked more cautiously. Jensen had already stood up, just a little disagreement. "Then it must be Candy's fault." Mr. Ambler's face turned stern. "I'll call her and give her a good scolding." Jensen stopped him. "No need, we'll handle it ourselves." "That's fine, couples fight at the head of the bed and make up at the foot." Mr. Ambler accompanied him with a smile as he walked out. When Jensen reached the car, he suddenly turned back. "Candy's household registration book should be here, right?" Mr. Ambler was first stunned, then overjoyed. "Yes, it's right here." "If you need it, Jensen, I'll go get it now." Jensen shook his head. "You keep it for now. If I need it in a few days, let Candy come back to get it." "That's fine, she can come get it anytime." The Ambler couple happily saw Jensen off. They had long given up hope for Jensen and Candy getting the marriage certificate. They were even prepared for Candy to be kicked out and for Jensen to marry someone else. But unexpectedly, there was a turn for the better. Jensen clearly had the intention of getting the marriage certificate with Candy. This was great news for the Ambler family. Let's see who would dare to laugh at them in the future, only considering them half-in-laws of the Sawyer family. After living for half a month in the town where I spent my childhood, I visited many other places I had always wanted to go. Anyway, I've always been very frugal. This large sum of money in my hands is more than enough for me to spend for a lifetime. I plan to buy a small one-bedroom apartment and settle down if I come across a town I like while traveling. When I was a child, I was sold, adopted, and stayed in welfare homes. What I longed for the most was to have a home that completely belonged to me. The Ambler family, where my biological parents are, is not my home. Jensen's house also doesn't count as my home. After all, for years of de facto marriage without a legal basis is just a castle in the air. Now that I've left there, the only things I can't let go of are the flowers I planted with my own hands. And of course, my beloved son, Jeremy, who I gave birth to with all my might. But I also know very clearly that it's best for Jeremy to stay with the Sawyer family. I'm different from others. I've been accustomed to separation since I was a child. So although I feel reluctant, I don't immerse myself in that kind of pain. Moreover, with me gone, everyone is happy. Jensen can also marry someone he truly likes. Although I never held the title of Mrs. Sawyer, I eventually returned to the small county where I had lived for a few years as a child. The house prices in the county are very low. I originally planned to buy a small house, but in the end, I bought a small courtyard. The local customs are particularly simple and honest. The most peaceful and happy time of my life was spent here. It's just a pity that the elderly couple who had fostered me for a few years had already passed away. When I was handling the transfer of ownership, I met my childhood playmate. Seeing me, Ansel Garside was very surprised. "Candy, is it really you?" When the Garside family adopted me, they changed my name to Candy Garside. I was also very surprised to see Ansel. I never thought that the small courtyard I bought was actually their house. "Brother Ansel, long time no see." Looking at Ansel, those long-lost warm memories surged over me like a tidal wave, making me uncontrollably burst into tears. "Aren't you married?" Ansel wanted to wipe my tears like he did when we were kids. But he raised his hand, then stopped. Where are your husband and child? Didn't they come with you? Candy, how have you been all these years? I heard your biological parents found you. Are they treating you well? I just shook my head. I couldn't speak, just wanted to have a good cry. People are like this, only in front of those who truly love them the most, do they dare to cry so freely. I hadn't seen Ansel for many years. But seeing him, I reverted to being the young Candy Garside. He also reverted to being the brother who always carried and coaxed me. They aren't treating you well, are they? Ansel's eyes were a bit red. If they were, you wouldn't be buying a house here alone. This place is hundreds of miles from the capital. Candy, how much have you suffered? Brother Ansel. I tugged at Ansel's sleeve, my swollen eyes smiling. I just saw the neighbor drying a lot of wild vegetables. Can you make that noodle soup from our childhood for me? Ansel looked at me for a long time. Then he patted my head like he used to and smiled. Sure, brother will make it for you. Jensen went to see Elena for the last time. At that banquet, Elena was in high spirits, like a flower in full bloom. But now, she looked noticeably haggard. Don't call me anymore. Let's not meet again. The house and the car will be transferred to you. Jensen looked at her. Her long hair fell over her shoulders, and she wore no makeup, looking very pitiful. She looked a lot like Norma. But for some reason, his heart didn't stir at all. I won't come here again. After saying that, Jensen turned and left. Elena couldn't help but cry. Mr. Sawyer, I don't understand. We were fine before, you said you liked me very much. I never liked you. But you said you wanted me to always stay with you. I have a wife. But you don't like her, do you? Jensen lowered his eyes and saw the wedding ring on his ring finger. Don't like her? If he really didn't like her at all, he had 1,000 ways to end the marriage. But when he first saw her at the Ambler family, he felt a sense of pity for her. Candy was just too timid, too quiet. Many times, she was like a shadow, barely noticeable. But in the months she had been gone, Jensen felt very uncomfortable. He tried going out with friends, indulging in pleasures, looking for new fun. He met people who resembled Norma even more than Elena did. But he didn't feel anything. He rarely thought of Norma anymore. Instead, he often thought of Candy. They had been married for 4 years. But in private, Candy was still too shy to look at him. When she smiled with her lips pursed, there were 2 dimples at the corners of her mouth. She had very fair skin, just like Jeremy, and was very beautiful. Now that he thought about it calmly, Jensen realized. In the 4 years of their marriage, they had been very affectionate, and he had never grown tired of her. In the months she wasn't home, he hadn't touched Elena. Just last night, he had dreamed of Candy. Dreamed of some very intimate scenes. Jensen suddenly instructed the driver, stop by a flower shop when we pass one. He bought a bouquet of red roses. In the evening, he went and bought a red dress. Candy actually looked very good in red. It complemented her fair skin and beautiful features. He decided to take a step back, bringing flowers and the dress, to take her home. And so, I settled down. After Ansel graduated from college, he started a business with his classmates. His company is in the city, and his daily life is very busy. But every weekend, he comes back to accompany me. The neighbor lady often teases me kindly, Candy, I see that Ansel really likes you. That day, you were watering flowers in the yard, and he was standing on the side pouring tea. The teacup was overflowing, and he didn't even notice. Through the fence, the lady's face crinkled with a smile. Candy, look, your brother Ansel is almost 30 and still doesn't have a wife. Why don't you marry him? After all, when you were kids playing house, Ansel was always your groom. My little boy was very upset about that. Ansel treats me very well. Even better than when we were kids. Although I'm a rather slow person, I have been married once. How could I not sense those feelings? Auntie, I don't know anything. I didn't go to college, and I don't have any special skills. Ansel is so excellent. His future wife will definitely be an outstanding girl too. I smiled, thinking of how Jensen never took me to those important banquets. How the Sawyer family never acknowledged me. How I wasn't even qualified to raise my own child. If I had grown up with my biological parents, studied hard, and earned a good degree, confident and capable, maybe that marriage wouldn't have failed so badly. Someone like me is probably more suited to living alone. Who says that? Ansel's voice suddenly came from outside the fence. As the sun set, he was dressed simply in a white shirt and black pants. Tall, elegant, and refined. The silent, skinny boy from childhood had grown up, now strong and tall, able to shield those he cares about from the wind and rain. Candy, you're great. Don't belittle yourself. Am I? I looked at Ansel, a bit confused. If I were really great, why didn't my family, husband, or child like me? Of course. Ansel pushed the gate and walked into the yard. Everyone's existence has its own meaning. If they didn't recognize that, it's their loss. But I still couldn't believe it. Ansel, like comforting a child, used the simplest examples to prove it to me. You can grow flowers. The same flowers always bloom more brightly in your hands. You also help Auntie Grace with her massages, and her back doesn't hurt as much anymore. A few days ago, when I worked overtime, you helped me organize files, data, and charts. You made everything simple and clear, which was a great help. If you let me, I could talk about it for 3 days and nights. Ansel laughed, and the lady laughed along. I could talk for 3 hours too. The dark clouds in my heart seemed to be easily swept away. That night, for the first time, I told Ansel about Jensen and Jeremy. Ansel was silent for a long time, not saying a word. Later, he drove back to the city overnight. When I heard the sound of his car leaving, I actually felt very calm inside. In these short 20-something years of life, I have experienced too many separations. It seemed like I had become numb. It was almost dawn when I finally fell asleep in a daze. But I soon heard the sound of a car again. I got up groggily and walked to the window, pulling open the curtains. I saw Ansel getting out of the car. He was holding something in his hand and quickly walked to my room. Candy. His voice was low, afraid of disturbing the neighbors. I quickly went to open the door. Ansel? Ansel stood there, his eyes still showing signs of fatigue, but his eyes were especially bright. Candy, I went back to get the household register. If you are willing, if you don't mind that I am several years older than you, let's go get the marriage certificate today. Get a marriage certificate? Yes, get the certificate. Ansel spoke very seriously. Once you have the certificate, you'll have a home, Candy. The word home had a temptation for me that perhaps surpassed that of ordinary people tenfold, 100-fold. So, what was just a procedural matter in Jensen's eyes was very significant and important to me. But for a child who had been drifting and living under someone else's roof, the first thing they learned was to read people's expressions. So, I never once took the initiative to ask him to get the certificate with me. It's laughable, isn't it? That someone as humble as me would still refuse to accept handouts. Candy, back then I was young and couldn't keep you at home. Later, when I went to college in the capital, I asked around about your whereabouts. Then, I heard your family had found you, and I was really happy for you. Your biological parents are very wealthy, so I thought their long-lost daughter would surely be cherished. And at that time, I was just a poor student, so I didn't want to disturb you. Ansel's eyes were filled with deep sorrow. If I had known they treated you badly, I would have definitely taken you away back then. Mom and Dad often talked about you. When Mom passed away, she even called your name. They don't want you, don't like you, but I do. Candy, I wasn't planning on getting married. But God sent you back to me. Ansel's voice suddenly choked up. This time, I don't want to miss out again. I don't know when, but my face was covered in tears. I was abducted and sold when I was young. My foster mother later had a son and didn't want to raise me anymore. I was often beaten, left cold, and had endless chores. It was Ansel's parents who pitied me and took me in for a few years. Later, my foster mother forcibly took me away and sold me to others. I was frequently beaten in that household, so I ran away. I had been to welfare homes, orphanages, and had been briefly adopted by others. The wandering days seemed like they would never end. I had thought about returning to the Garside family, but was afraid of being caught and sold again by my foster mother. So, I never dared to go back. I didn't expect Ansel had been looking for me all this time. I also didn't expect that Mrs. Garside still thought of me when she passed away. And I certainly didn't expect to reunite with Ansel like this. Perhaps this is true fate. And everything with the Ambler family and the Sawyer family was just another ordeal to endure for today. I cried with tears streaming down my face, yet looked at Ansel and shook my head with a smile. Ansel, I can't get the certificate with you today. Candy. I saw the light in Ansel's eyes almost shatter. It made me feel very, very sad. So I gently held his hand. My household registration book is still with the Ambler family. It will take a day to go and come back. I never expected that retrieving the household registration book from the Ambler family would be so smooth. Nor did I expect my parents to treat me with such kindness and affection. But these were things I had longed for deeply. Yet now, they seemed insignificant to me. When I left with the household registration book, they smiled and reminded me, when you get the marriage certificate, bring Jensen back for a meal. I knew they had misunderstood. But I didn't explain. There was no need to complicate matters. Given their way of handling things, if they knew I was marrying a man who didn't even have 1% of Jensen's wealth, they would probably die of anger. After leaving the Ambler family, I took a cab directly to the airport. On the way to the airport, I received a call from Ansel. Candy, I can't wait any longer. I just arrived in the capital, just got off the plane. Wait for me, we'll get the certificate in the capital. I couldn't help but smile. Okay, I'll wait for you. After hanging up, I quickly told the driver, Sir, I'm not going to the airport anymore. I need to go to the Civil Affairs Bureau. Please hurry. The day after Ansel and I got the certificate. He took me shopping for many things. Gold jewelry, clothes, and 2 luxury brand bags. I actually don't like these things, but Ansel said that whatever others have, I must also have. Ansel then took me to pay respects to his parents. Then there was the banquet in his hometown. For the wedding, he wanted to take me back to the city for a proper ceremony. He specifically bought a red dress for me to wear on the day of the banquet. When trying it on, I walked out to the yard, somewhat awkwardly holding the hem of the dress. It was the best time of spring. At dusk, the crabapple flowers had not yet fallen asleep. Looking at Ansel, I somehow recalled what Jensen had said that day. Do I look bad in red? Ansel shook his head, always so disciplined and respectful, even asking for permission before holding my hand. But at that moment, he suddenly leaned down and kissed me. My wife is very beautiful. I was stunned for a moment, then couldn't help but smile. When Ansel was about to end the light kiss, I lifted my face and slowly closed my eyes. Jensen stood outside the simple fence. The red roses in his hand fell to the ground, petals scattered. He saw the sweet smile on Candy's lips. Those dimples that made her smile even more beautiful. But they pierced his heart deeply. He finally lost control and forcefully pushed open the bamboo gate. The loud noise startled Candy and the man, making them turn their heads. Jensen Sawyer? Candy's face was full of surprise and astonishment. And the man, tightly protecting her in his arms, looked extremely wary. Jensen didn't even glance at Ansel. He stepped forward and grabbed Candy's wrist. Come back with me. But Candy didn't move. She even forcefully freed her hand from his. Jensen turned around, his eyes flickering. Candy, I'll say it again, come back with me. Jensen, I made it very clear before, I won't go back. Didn't you always want to get the certificate with me? Jensen took out the household registration book he carried with him. Candy, if you come back with me now, we can register for marriage tomorrow. But I'm already married. Jensen felt as if something exploded in his ears. What did you say? Jensen Sawyer, I'm already married. Just yesterday, Ansel and I got our marriage certificate. I looked at him calmly. I went back to the Ambler family yesterday to get the documents. Jensen seemed to laugh angrily at my words. Candy, don't forget, you've been married to me for 4 years and gave birth to Jeremy. I haven't forgotten, but I want to make one point clear. We didn't register our marriage, so our marriage isn't legally binding. So, Jensen, I was never really married to you. You should go back now, and from now on, you'll have to take good care of Jeremy." After saying this, I turned around and stopped looking at him. "Ansel, let's go inside. I'm a bit tired." I held Ansel's hand, and he immediately gripped it tightly. "Okay, I'll take you to rest." "Candy." Jensen took another step forward and grabbed me again. "Jeremy misses you a lot." I felt my throat tighten instantly, and the next moment, my eyes turned red. Jeremy is only a little over 3 years old, he doesn't understand anything. Even if he isn't close to me, I've never resented him. It's just that some mother-child relationships are destined to be shallow. "Come back with me, and I'll have someone bring Jeremy over. From now on, we can be together as a family of 3. I felt an overwhelming urge to cry, finding it all incredibly ironic. So he knew everything. He knew I missed Jeremy, knew I dreamed of reuniting with him. But he watched as Mrs. Sawyer took Jeremy away, refusing to fulfill my wish. Now that I want nothing and am leaving, he wants to bring Jeremy back. So Jeremy could have been brought back after all. It turns out, some filial duties don't need to be observed. Jensen, there's no need for that now. I forcefully shook off his hand again. We don't need to reunite as a family of 3. If Jeremy misses me, he can come to see me. If you allow it, I'll also visit him regularly. Candy, Jeremy is your biological son. You had a difficult labor when giving birth to him, you risked your life to bring him into the world. If you abandon him, aren't you afraid that if I remarry, someone else might mistreat him?" I had never seen Jensen with such an expression. Even when he was angry in the past, he was always gentle. But now, his eyes were bulging with rage, and his handsome face looked somewhat ferocious. When Jeremy was born, they used him to threaten me. Now that I'm leaving, they use the same tactic to threaten me. But I'm no longer afraid of losing anything. Ansel taught me that I am Candy first, then a wife or a mother. Those years passed in a daze, and I had long lost myself. It wasn't entirely others' fault that they looked down on me and didn't care about me. So now, I want to be myself first. Jeremy is my flesh and blood, but he's yours too. He was raised by Mrs. Sawyer since he was a month old. For over 3 years, she has loved him dearly and wouldn't let him suffer. Moreover, if that day really comes. I took a deep breath. Jensen, I will fight for his custody in court. So, you're determined to be with him? I nodded, yes. Just for a red dress? Jensen sneered, Candy, in the past 4 years, what I've given you, how much can he give you? It's not just for a red dress. I looked up at Ansel. There was anger and frustration in his eyes, but more than that, there was heartache and guilt. Jensen, you can have many people you like. But in my husband's heart and eyes, there can only be me. I've already cut ties with Elena. And Norma, I've long since let her go. Candy, no matter what, we were married for 4 years. I don't have no feelings for you. Jensen frowned deeply. It was clear he was reluctant to talk about these things. Reluctant to admit that he had feelings for me now. As if liking someone like me was a condescending favor from someone of higher status. A favor that couldn't be openly acknowledged. But I no longer longed for his meager affection. In the gradually deepening twilight, the crabapple flowers I planted myself were still beautiful. Even more beautiful than those in the Sawyer family's garden. Jensen said he had let go. So have I. For years of being together had worn away all the affection I had for him from our first meeting. Now, I'm going to live an ordinary and stable life. Jensen, I once loved you. But now, it's all gone. Go back, and don't come looking for me again. You should marry someone who matches your knowledge and experience, someone you can proudly show off. Not someone like me who only knows how to tend to flowers and plants. These 4 years, I've delayed you. I'm sorry, Jensen Sawyer. I stood in the night breeze and took one last look at Jensen. In fact, back then, he didn't break off the engagement and married me. I was really grateful in my heart. Because at that time every moment in the Ambler family was like torture. Jensen took me away from the Ambler family and gave me a temporary home. To me at that time, it was truly a kind of salvation. After all, if he had broken off the engagement then, The Ambler family might have treated me like a commodity, selling me off to any man. And for someone who had been sold several times since childhood, it would have been nothing short of a nightmare. So even now, I hope he has a good life in the second half of his life. I also don't want to become mortal enemies with Jeremy's biological father. If we can part peacefully, that would be the best outcome. Jensen Sawyer's perspective. Candy and Ansel's wedding was quite grand. Considering Ansel's financial situation at the time, the wedding budget was quite high. But since he was willing, others naturally praised his deep affection. Candy cried at the wedding, and she cried quite fiercely. When she married me back then, she didn't cry that much. She also said, "My name is Candy, every letter is sweet, but my life before was filled with bitterness. I am very grateful to my husband." Hearing these words at the time was quite harsh. During the 4 years she was married to me, I don't think I treated her badly. In my circle, having mistresses and lovers was too common to count. Which young master hasn't kept 7 or 8 lovers? But I only foolishly kept one, Elena. And I quickly grew tired of her. Besides that, I considered myself quite clean. I don't believe her husband, Ansel, could really stay faithful forever. Men, without money, will still cheat, let alone when they have money. So I also let out some rumors privately. Ansel's company grew bigger and made more money. Naturally, the temptations would also increase. By that time, with Candy's temperament, she would surely not tolerate it. If she divorced Ansel, and I took Jeremy to find her, maybe she would come back to us. But in the blink of an eye, 10 years passed. Ansel really never made a single mistake. Candy gave him a daughter. She looks exactly like her. I was insanely jealous. Jeremy grew up, looking more and more like me. Although the Sawyer family members are all good-looking, being a lonely person like me is not a good thing. Her relationship with Jeremy got better and better. It's natural for a mother and son to have a good relationship, not like the irreconcilable hatred described in novels. Sometimes Jeremy would stay with her for a few days. Candy would naturally have him take care of his sister. Their sibling relationship is exceptionally good. Sometimes Candy would come to our house to see Jeremy. When they talked, I would feel quite out of place and go outside to tend to the flowers. Every time I wanted to take her back. But Ansel would always personally come to pick her up. He guarded against me like I was a flood or a beast. But this is also good. With me as an example, Ansel wouldn't make the mistakes that all men would make. So Candy, the rest of her life, would naturally be filled with sweetness.